Chapter 13. At daylight, Jim woke and built a fire, then crawled back into his eiderdown till the interior of the hut was warm. Still in his woolen underwear, he got breakfast, and finally, pulling on the Hudson Bay duffels over his heavy socks, he charged out into the sharp morning cold. The night's airing had done a good deal for his parka, sweater, and blanket cloth breeches. Back in the heated cabin, they made him wrinkle his nose a little as he put them on, but their odor was no longer unbearable. The more he thought about his adventure, the funnier it appeared to him. By the time he had the dogs harnessed, he was laughing so hard the tears ran down his face and froze on his cheeks. From Beaver Lake, he cut back to the squaw and followed the Trapline River to his lower camp, which he reached in the middle of the day. He had intended to push on a few miles, but a glimpse of the cabin he caught from the river changed his plans. Something was wrong up there. Scrambling up the bank ahead of the team, he found the stout door of hewn planks hanging open on one hinge. A ridge of snow had drifted in across the threshold log. The earthen floor beyond was littered with chips, scraps of paper, and split flour. Jim's scowl was black as he strode inside. A large hole had been gnawed in the grub box, and all the provisions, which were not in tin cans, had been wholly or partially destroyed. Looking around more carefully, he found the tracks of a porcupine and many squirrels in the snow around the entrance. But no squirrel or hedgehog alive would have played such havoc on the door. The hinges had been double straps of thick moose hide, firmly nailed in place. He saw that the upper one was wrenched free, the nails pulled out of the solid spruce. It had taken weight and strength to do that. Rust on the nails showed that the damage had been done some time before, and several snows had fallen in the meantime, obliterating any tracks that might have shown outside. It was while he was putting the door back in place that Jim came to the sole clue he would ever have to find out this mystery. Caught behind a splinter on the outer surface of the plank was a long, stiff hair, gray-white on one end, shaded to dark brown on the other. The boy had scraped enough moose skins to recognize it instantly. Perhaps some big bull moose thought the cabin was an enemy. Perhaps he had merely rubbed his huge body a little too hard against the door. At any rate, a moose had began the trouble that the rodents had finished. He nailed the hinge fast with his axe and set about tidying up the floor. By the time he had made things shipshape, it was near too dark to go any further. He cooked supper and fed the dogs and got ready for bed. He still had traps to visit downriver as far as the burnt land. Breaking trail next morning, he was striding along a dozen paces ahead of the dogs when he heard an ominous crack under his feet. The next instant he was plunging downward through the ice. In that second, while he fell, a chain of swift thoughts flashed through his mind. Water, freezing cold. Would he be able to get out, or to build a fire if he did? But, amazingly, there was no water. He landed with a crash on solid ice 5 feet down. A rocky rapid just below had dammed up the river before the big freeze came in November. When the water went down, it had left a thin shell of ice an inch or two in thickness with a chamber of airspace beneath it. Jim took off his wrenched snowshoes and laid them on the crust at the edge of the hole and pulled himself up carefully till he lay belly down on the thin ice. Then he warned the dogs back and wiggled his way to shore. As soon as they got below the rapids, the river ice was firm again. He worked to the end of the trap line by noon and returned to the lower camp with one mink to add to his store of fur. The next day was the 20th, getting near Christmas. Mindful of his promise to be at Waba on the 24th, he turned the trail early in the morning and instead of stopping at Beaver Lake, covered the 20 miles to the head of the long portage. As he drew close to his home camp the following afternoon, he made a bet with himself. If there's any fur in these last 4 traps, I'll open a can of peaches and have a real feast for supper. His imagination grew reckless then. If there's 2 pelts, he told himself, I'll bake a cake with raisins in it. The first trap, like all the others he'd visited, was empty. "Doggone it," he grumbled. "I had my mouth all set for those peaches." He hiked on wearily to the next cubby and gave a whistle of joy. There was a fine mink in the trap, and 5 minutes later he raised a triumphant yell that sent the echoes ringing and the dogs barking. Another mink! There was one trap left. "Oh well," he chuckled, "let's make it a sporting proposition. If I get anything more, by gosh, I'll frost that cake with sugar icing." He approached the blazed tree that marked the location of the last trap house, and his heart beat fast. With a run of luck like this, there just might be possible. "Oh boy," he breathed. "Gosh, if it ain't a fisher!" Never in all of his life had he seen such satiny black fur. It was a female, a trifle larger than Miranda, and a far more perfect pelt. Almost reverently he carried the dark body to the cabin. "Darned if I don't believe that's the finest fisher ever caught in Thunder Bay District," he murmured in awe tones. True to his pledge, Jim built a good fire to heat the oven and started mixing his cake. There was no eggs, of course, but he knew how to use plain flour, dried milk, and baking powder, and he put in a double handful of raisins. He fed the dogs and prepared the rest of his meal while the cake was baking. It was late when the food was finally ready, and he had not eaten since dawn. But it was worth the wait. His ravenous appetite did full justice to the feast, and no creation of any fancy chef ever tasted more delicious than the peaches and raisin cake with which he topped it off. Jim spent the next day, the 22nd, in camp. He had some clothes to be washed and plenty of fur to skin. When those chores were done, he cut and hauled firewood till darkness fell. In the morning he packed all of his cured pelts on the sled and set out southward towards Porcupine Lake. Pat and Bruno seemed to know that a holiday was in the offing. They scampered over the beaten trail, as frisky as the chickadees that sang above them in the spruces. At the lake, Jim swung northeast, following Porcupine River, and spent the night at his shack there. With the first gray of dawn he roused and sat up in his sleeping bag. Half awake, he could not at first identify the tingling sense of pleasure that filled him. Then he remembered. Christmas Eve. He hurried through breakfast and harnessed the dogs. "Come on there, Bruno," he called jubilantly. "Let's see a travel." The trails were well packed and fast. The dogs plunged eagerly into their collars and made the 7 miles back to the lake in an hour, while Jim panted along in their wake. At the head of Porcupine, he turned them to the left for the 12-mile overland trip to Wabing. They were no longer moving over level ice, and their pace was slower, but noonday found them approaching the Waba cabin. There was a cheerful spiral of smoke rising straight upward in the clear, frosty air. Out by the woodpile, one of the girls was singing. Jim cupped his hands and launched a shout that brought an immediate answering hail. When his team pulled into the yard, the whole family was out to greet him. He hugged his mother and sisters and gave Lindsay a resounding slap on the back. "Where'd you come from, kid?" he asked, laughing. "Thought I'd beat you in for once." "Not this time," said the younger boy. "I finished a day early and got here last night. Came down from Poplar Lake with Dad." Jim looked at his father in surprise. "What?" he exclaimed. "You went up there by yourself?" Big Lindsay chuckled. "Sure did," he said. "More'n that, I went to town. Trail was good, and I rode the sled most of the way." "Wait till you see what he brought back," cried Ida. "A turkey and—" "Hold on now, daughter," Miss Vanderbeck interrupted. "Don't try to tell everything. Half the fun of Christmas is being surprised." That afternoon the boys helped their father finish such odd jobs as needed doing. Tomorrow there would be no work. When darkness fell, the girls brought out 2 wreaths of ground pine that they had made and hung them in the front windows. Then a pair of candles were lit and placed in the broad sills where they would shine out over the snow. There was no fireplace in the cabin and no place to hang up stockings. However, the Vanderbecks had a system of distributing Christmas gifts that was all their own. With a bit of chalk, Lindsay marked out a square on the floor at the foot of each bed place. Then the lights were extinguished except for one dim candle. With a deal of mysterious tiptoeing and giggling, the family made the rounds, depositing such gifts as they had. Good nights were said and the candle put out, then they all went to bed. A riot of laughter and shouting woke Jim out of a dreamless slumber. It was dark outside, but the lamp on the puncheon table had been lit, and the girls were going from bed to bed, crying, "Merry Christmas!" Big Lindsay sat up with a chuckle. "Brrr," he said, his breath rising in a white cloud. "Get that fire going, somebody. It's colder than a dog's nose." Jim hustled some kindling into the stove and lit it, while his brother scratched away the frost on the window pane and looked at the thermometer that hung outside. 40 below, he announced, and fine bright starlight. Looks like it's going to be a nice day. With the flames roaring in the stove, it didn't take long for the temperature inside the cabin to grow more comfortable. Miss Vanderbeck began making gestures towards getting breakfast, but the girls forbade it. "You know the rule, Ma," they told her laughingly. "Presents come first. Sit down, everyone, and open one at a time." They took turns, starting with Lindsay, the youngest. No bright ribbons or fancy wrappings adorned these gifts. Even paper was a luxury at Waba, and some of the packages were done up in birch bark and tied with rawhide thongs. In his pile, Jim found a handsome plaid shirt of 22-ounce Mackinaw cloth from his father, 2 pairs of wool socks knitted by the girls, a box of rifle cartridges from Lindsay, and from his mother a pair of double-knit wool mitts with fur-trimmed caribou hide gauntlets to cover them. There were also 2 or 3 remembrances that had come by mail, among them a book of trout flies from a wealthy sportsman in the States. The others, meanwhile, were opening their own presents and holding them up for inspection. Simple, useful articles for the most part, though Big Lindsay had brought the women folks some bits of feminine adornment from Toronto. Jim's gifts to his family were homemade things he had worked on during his lonely evenings in camp. Deerskin moccasins for his sister, stout moose-hide belts for the 2 Lindsays, a birch bark sewing basket for his mother. "A pretty swell Christmas, I call it," said Ida when the presents had all been examined. "And now, Ma, you just set still while Mary and I get breakfast on the table." When the low winter sun came up, it was, as the Lindsay had prophesied, a fine, clear day. The boys took their rifles down to the lake and held a shooting match, 5 rounds apiece at 200 yards. Their targets was the top of a tin can, 6 inches in diameter. Each of them drilled it twice after long, careful sighting. They were congratulating each other on their marksmanship when Big Lindsay strolled down the landing. "Mind if I have a turn?" he asked. "Don't know as I can do much. Ain't as steady as I used to be, but I might be able to hit a big mark like that." He raised Jim's rifle and fired 5 times in quick succession. 4 of the 5 shots were clean bullseyes, and the 5th creased the outer edge of the tin. "Yes," he said apologizingly. "I've slipped, I guess. Arms are getting tired on that last one." "Gosh, old hemlock," breathed Jim in a tone of respect. "I'd like to see you on a day that you were good." Dinner that day was an event to be remembered. 4 hours of busy labor on the part of Miss Vanderbeck and the girls went into its preparation. About 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Ida came to the door and announced that everything was ready. The men trooped in from the sled and sniffed hungrily at the warm, fragrant air. A big brown turkey graced the head of the board. Flanking it on either side were dishes of mashed potatoes and Hubbard squash. In addition, there was homemade pickles and preserves and smoking hot biscuits. Big Lindsay whet the carving knife. "Ladies and gentlemen," he said with an air of ceremony, "be seated." But just at that moment they heard a faint approaching jingle of bells. "Must be Santa Claus coming," grinned Jim. His brother had run to the window. "It's a meal," he cried. "Set another place at the table, Mary. We've got company." They threw the door wide and welcomed the French trapper with halloos and cheers. His fast team of 4 police dogs came up the trail at a smart trot, and behind them the Vanderbecks could see the flash of Emil's grin in the furred hood of his parka. "Surprised, eh?" he called. "Merry Christmas, everybody." When he had unhitched and chained his dogs, Emil Coot came in and warmed his hands at the fire. "Take your things off and set right down," said big Lindsay. "I sorter have thought the smell of that turkey roasting would be noticeable in your part of the country." The boys laughed. Emil's trap line lay 20 miles to the east on the drowning river. "I can't smell that far," grinned the Frenchman, "but I got a good calendar." He took his place with the rest at the table. "How do you like them bells on my team, eh?" he asked. "Ought to be grand at scaring the game," Jim replied. "They do sound nice, though, sort of Christmassy." The high-piled plates passed down the line, and for a time they were all too busy for conversation. At last, when even the plum pudding was eaten, and the 2 older men had lit after-dinner pipes, the talk began again. Emil reported good trapping down the drowning. "Got 4 fish already," he concluded. "Maybe 200-300's worth of fur on my sled." "I'll bet I caught one animal none of you ever caught," Jim put in. Into the accompaniment of howls of laughter, he told them the story of the skunk. His father moved his chair away in haste. He remarked. "I thought you smelled a little high yesterday. Funny, though, that's the first skunk I've heard in these parts for 5 years. The brief winter afternoon passed quickly. They played bridge and other games, chatted and sang songs. After some urging, big Lindsay consented to repeating all 9 verses of his poem, The Ballad of Serpent Lake, or Johnson and the Moose. He was famous all throughout New Brunswick and northern Ontario as a maker of rhymes, and the family never tired of hearing them. When dusk came on and the lamps were lit, Ida suggested a candy pull. She was soon at work over the stove, and the tangy sweet pungence of cooking molasses filled the room. "Better get your hands buttered, folks," she announced at length. "This stuff's almost ready to pull." Just then there was a small, timid knock at the door of the cabin. Mary looked at her mother quizzically. "More visitors?" she asked, and went to lift the latch. A young Indian girl, thin, scared-looking, stood on the threshold. She held out a tin, battered cup. "You got 'em salt?" she asked in a frightened whisper. The gathered household stared at her for a moment. Then Miss Vanderbeck spoke briskly. "Why, sure," she said. "Come right in." They could see a hungry gleam in the girl's eyes as she stepped forward timidly and sniffed the molasses-laden air. Mary smiled at her. "You been celebrating Christmas?" she asked, trying to make conversation. "No," said the girl. "Didn't your pa bring you any Christmas gifts?" "No," she said again, shaking her head. Miss Vanderbeck exchanged a glance with her husband. "Well, for land's sake," she murmured compassionately. Jim saw that the girl, for all of her frail smallness, must be 15 or 16 years old. She had on a pair of greasy deerskin breeches and a torn cotton dress, and over it a ragged old canvas parka. The hood hung down back from her black braids and flat, high-cheekboned little face. Ida set the candy pan on the back of the stove and walked across to the curtained closet by her bed. "I declare," she said almost violently, "I'm going to give that child my old sweater and a pair of mittens. Look at those hands." Miss Vanderbeck nodded. "Good idea," she said. "I got some thick stockings I just finished knitting, too." So it was that the dazed Indian girl left the cabin. She had not only her borrowed salt, but warm wool between her and the biting frost. They went ahead with their candy pull when she was gone, but some of the gaiety had gone out of the evening. "Seems kind of tough on the other 5 kids, the little ones, doesn't it?" said Jim. "They're probably bad off as she. No Christmas, gosh." "I'll tell you what," beamed Mary, flushed and warm from the pulling. "Soon as this done, we'll take up the candy to their camp. Dear knows we don't need it after that dinner." The golden strings had already begun to stiffen and lose their stickiness. Mary set the candy in the shed to chill, and the 4 young Vanderbecks donned their outdoor garments. Emil said he'd rather stay and talk to their parents. "Whee!" cried Lindsay as he tied on his snowshoes. "It'll be cold tonight, all right, but this is going to be fun. Just look at that moon."